The dusty courthouse steps of Redemption Valley echoed with cruel laughter as 12-year-old Henry Walsh clutched a wrinkled piece of paper to his chest, his small frame trembling with desperation as he faced Sheriff Buck Morrison, a man whose badge had become a shield for corruption rather than a symbol of justice. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the scene, unfolding before a growing crowd of townspeople, some watching with sympathy, others with the kind of morbid curiosity that drew people to witness suffering they were powerless or unwilling to prevent. Henry's parents had died 3 months earlier when their cabin burned down during a lightning storm, leaving him with nothing but a faded deed to 40 acres of seemingly worthless land on the outskirts of town, and the desperate hope that legal documents might somehow protect an orphaned child in a world designed to favor those with money and power. The boy's clothes were patched and too large, his face gaunt from irregular meals, and his eyes held the kind of hollow desperation that came from having nowhere else to turn for help. "Please, Sheriff Morrison," Henry said, his voice cracking, with emotion as he held up the deed with hands that shook from hunger and fear. "This paper says the land belongs to my family. My pa told me it would always be mine, that nobody could take it away as long as I had this deed." Sheriff Morrison, a man whose 43 years had been spent accumulating power through intimidation and corruption, took the document from Henry's trembling hands and made a show of examining it with exaggerated seriousness. He was a large man whose star-shaped badge gleamed on his chest like a mockery of the justice it was supposed to represent, and his cold eyes showed nothing but contempt for the desperate child standing before him. "Well, well," Morrison said, with theatrical surprise, his voice carrying easily across the courthouse square. "Looks like little Henry here thinks he owns property in my town. Ain't that something, folks?" The crowd began to murmur among themselves, some clearly uncomfortable with Morrison's treatment of an orphaned child, but none willing to challenge a man whose reputation for violence had made him untouchable to most of the law-abiding citizens of Redemption Valley. Morrison held the deed up to the light, as if studying it carefully, then suddenly burst into harsh laughter that echoed off the courthouse walls like the sound of breaking glass. "Boy," he said with obvious relish, "this here piece of paper ain't worth the cost of the ink that wrote it. You see, there's been some changes in the local property assessments, and it turns out your daddy owed more in back taxes than this worthless patch of dirt could ever be worth." The casual dismissal of Henry's only inheritance sent a chill through the boy's heart, but he straightened his shoulders with the kind of courage that desperation sometimes inspired in those who had nothing left to lose. "That's not true," Henry said quietly, his voice carrying despite its youth and the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. "Pa always paid his taxes. He showed me the receipts, kept them in the Bible where nobody could steal them." Morrison's expression darkened at being contradicted by a child, and his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip in a gesture that made several people in the crowd step backward in alarm. "Are you calling me a liar, boy?" Morrison asked, his voice dropping to the dangerous tone that had preceded violence in too many previous encounters. "Because in this town, questioning the sheriff's word is a serious offense that can get a person in more trouble than they can handle." But before Henry could respond, another voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, calm and controlled, but carrying an undertone of authority that made even Morrison pause in his intimidation of the desperate child. "I believe the boy asked you a reasonable question about his property rights, Sheriff. Seems like a lawman ought to be able to provide legal justification for his actions instead of just threats and bluster." The voice belonged to Marcus Kane, a man who had just ridden into Redemption Valley that morning, but whose presence immediately commanded attention and respect from everyone who saw him. Marcus was tall and lean, built like a man who had spent his life in the saddle, with steel-grey eyes that missed nothing, and hands that rested casually near his guns with the confidence of someone who knew how to use them. Marcus Kane's reputation had preceded him into town, whispered stories about a former federal marshal who had resigned his commission rather than enforce corrupt orders from Washington politicians, a man whose integrity was legendary throughout the territories, but whose methods were said to be as hard as the frontier itself when dealing with those who preyed on the innocent. "This ain't your concern, stranger," Morrison said, but his voice lacked the confident bluster he had shown when dealing with a helpless child. "The boy's situation is a local matter that doesn't concern federal authorities." "Former federal authority," Marcus corrected quietly, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace and approaching the courthouse steps with the kind of measured pace that experienced gunfighters recognized as preparation for action. "But I still take an interest in situations where children are being mistreated by men who ought to know better." The crowd began to sense that they were witnessing the beginning of a confrontation that would be talked about for years to come, a moment when corruption and integrity were about to face each other directly, with no room for compromise or retreat. Henry looked up at Marcus with the desperate hope of a drowning man seeing a rope, sensing that this stranger might represent the first real chance for justice he had encountered since his parents' death. "Sir," Henry said quietly, "I know my pa paid his taxes. He was always careful about legal things, said a man's word, and his paperwork were all that stood between him and those who wanted to steal what he'd worked for." Marcus knelt down to Henry's level, his experienced eyes taking in the boy's obvious hunger and desperation, while his ears processed the simple honesty in the child's voice. "What's your name, son?" Marcus asked gently, his tone showing none of the condescension that adults typically used when addressing children. "Henry Walsh, sir. My parents were Robert and Mary Walsh, and they owned 40 acres out by Willow Creek until the fire took them both." Marcus nodded, his expression showing the kind of careful attention that suggested he was filing away every detail of Henry's story for future reference. "And this deed," Marcus continued, taking the document from Morrison's reluctant hands, "shows clear title to those 40 acres, with all taxes paid through the current year. The statement was delivered with the authority of someone who knew how to read legal documents, and several people in the crowd began to murmur among themselves as they realized that the stranger's assessment contradicted Morrison's claims about back taxes. "That deed's been invalidated by county assessments," Morrison said quickly, his voice showing the first signs of uncertainty as he faced someone who obviously couldn't be intimidated or bought off. "The boy's got no legal claim to that property anymore." "Interesting," Marcus said thoughtfully, his steel-grey eyes studying Morrison with the kind of intensity that made guilty men nervous. "Because according to territorial law, property assessments have to be posted publicly for 60 days before taking effect, and the property owner has to be notified in writing of any changes." The legal knowledge that Marcus displayed was far beyond what most frontier lawmen possessed, and Morrison's growing discomfort suggested that the sheriff's version of events might not withstand careful scrutiny. "Where are those public notices?" "Sheriff," Marcus asked quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of enforcing the law properly rather than using it for personal gain. "And where are the written notifications that should have been sent to the Walsh family?" Morrison's face began to redden as he realized that his casual corruption was being challenged by someone who actually understood the legal procedures that were supposed to protect property owners from arbitrary seizure. "Those are administrative matters that don't concern outsiders," Morrison said defensively, but his voice lacked conviction as he faced questions he couldn't answer without revealing his own illegal activities. "Actually, they concern me very much," Marcus replied with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "You see, when I resigned my federal commission, I retained my authority to investigate territorial crimes, including official corruption and the illegal seizure of private Property. The revelation that Marcus still possessed federal law enforcement authority sent a visible shock through Morrison, who suddenly realized that his comfortable arrangement of local corruption was being threatened by someone with the power to do something about it. "The boy keeps his land," Marcus said simply, his words carrying the finality of a judge's verdict. "The deed is valid, the taxes are current, and any attempt to seize that property without proper legal procedure will be treated as theft under territorial and federal law." Morrison's hand moved closer to his gun, his desperation making him consider violence as a solution to his legal problems, but Marcus's next words stopped him cold. "Sheriff Morrison," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying across the courthouse square like a death knell, "I'm giving you until sundown to produce the legal documentation justifying your attempt to steal this boy's inheritance. If you can't provide that documentation, I'll be taking your badge and placing you under arrest for official corruption." The ultimatum hung in the afternoon air like smoke from a wildfire, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would change everything about how justice was administered in Redemption Valley. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across Redemption Valley's main street, Marcus Kane spent the hours before his confrontation with Sheriff Morrison conducting the kind of thorough investigation that had made him legendary during his years as a federal marshal. The truth he uncovered during those few hours was worse than even his experienced cynicism had prepared him to discover, revealing a network of corruption that had turned local law enforcement into an instrument of theft and intimidation. Henry Walsh had remained close to Marcus throughout the investigation, his young face showing a mixture of hope and terror as he watched the man who might be his salvation methodically gather evidence that could either restore his inheritance or get them both killed by desperate criminals with badges. The boy's presence served as a constant reminder of what was at stake in the coming confrontation. Not just justice in the abstract, but the future of a child who had already lost everything except his faith in the power of legal documents to protect the innocent. Marcus's first stop had been the county clerk's office, where a nervous administrator named Peterson had been unable to produce any of the documentation that would have justified seizing the Walsh property for back taxes. Under Marcus's experienced questioning, Peterson had revealed that Sheriff Morrison had been systematically manipulating property records to justify seizures that benefited his political allies and business partners. "I never meant for it to go this far," Peterson had confessed, his hands shaking as he showed Marcus the altered records that documented years of illegal property transfers. "Morrison said we were just adjusting assessments to reflect current market values. But I can see now that he was stealing from families who couldn't fight back." The documentary evidence that Marcus collected painted a picture of corruption so systematic and brazen that it represented a complete abandonment of the principles that were supposed to govern law enforcement in civilized society. Morrison hadn't just been taking bribes or looking the other way on minor crimes. He had been actively orchestrating a criminal enterprise that used official authority to rob citizens of their most valuable possessions. "Mr. Kane," Henry said quietly as they walked back toward the courthouse square where the final confrontation would take place. "What happens if Sheriff Morrison won't give up his badge? What happens if he tries to fight you instead of admitting what he's done?" Marcus looked down at the boy whose courage and honesty had triggered this entire sequence of events, understanding that Henry deserved an honest answer about the dangers they were both facing. "Henry," Marcus said gently, "some men would rather die than admit they've been wrong, especially when admitting their crimes means facing prison time. If Morrison chooses to fight rather than surrender peacefully, then I'll do whatever is necessary to protect innocent people from a corrupt lawman." The boy nodded, with the kind of mature understanding that came from having witnessed more adult cruelty and corruption than any child should have to see, and Marcus felt a surge of protective anger at the circumstances that had forced such wisdom on someone so young. As they approached the courthouse square, they could see that word of the impending confrontation had spread throughout Redemption Valley, drawing a crowd that included not just the curious, but also people who had been victims of Morrison's corruption and were hoping to finally see justice served. Among them stood merchants who had been forced to pay protection money, ranchers who had lost property through questionable legal procedures, and families who had been terrorized into silence by a sheriff who used his badge to shield criminal behavior. Sheriff Morrison was waiting on the courthouse steps, flanked by two deputies whose loyalty had been purchased through shared criminal profits rather than earned through legitimate law enforcement. His hand rested on his gun butt, and his face showed the kind of desperate determination that characterized cornered animals preparing for their final stand. "Well, well," Morrison called out as Marcus approached, his voice carrying the false bravado that guilty men often displayed when facing inevitable consequences for their actions. "If it isn't the famous Marcus Kane, come to clean up our little town with his federal authority and moral superiority." "Just came to see the documentation you promised to produce, Sheriff," Marcus replied calmly, his voice carrying easily across the square despite its conversational tone. "The legal justification for seizing the Walsh property and all the other questionable transfers you've authorized over the past few years." Morrison's laugh was harsh and bitter, containing none of the cruel amusement he had shown earlier when mocking Henry's desperate pleas for justice. "You want to see my documentation? Here's all the documentation I need." The sheriff's hand moved to his gun, but Marcus was faster, his Colt clearing leather with the fluid speed that had made him legendary throughout the territories. The sound of the hammer being cocked echoed across the courthouse square like thunder, and Morrison froze with his own weapon only halfway drawn. "I wouldn't," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that experienced gunfighters recognized as the prelude to sudden death. "You're already facing federal charges for corruption and theft. Adding attempted murder of a federal officer would just make the noose that much more certain." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with the crowd holding its collective breath as they waited to see whether Morrison would choose surrender or suicide by attempting to outdraw a man whose reputation for speed and accuracy was legendary throughout the West. But it was Henry Walsh who broke the tension, stepping forward with the kind of courage that only children possessed when fighting for something that mattered more than their own safety. "Sheriff Morrison," Henry said quietly, his young voice carrying across the square with surprising authority, "I know you think I'm just a stupid kid who doesn't understand how the world works, but I understand more than you think I do." Morrison's eyes flicked toward the boy, confusion replacing some of the desperate fury in his expression as he tried to understand what role a 12-year-old child could play in this deadly confrontation. "I understand that you're not really a bad man," Henry continued, his words carrying the kind of innocent wisdom that sometimes penetrated adult cynicism more effectively than threats or legal arguments. "I'd think you started out wanting to help people, wanting to make this town safe and fair for everyone who lived here." The unexpected compassion in Henry's voice seemed to strike Morrison like a physical blow, and for a moment his face showed something that might have been shame before the hardness returned to his features. "But somewhere along the way, you forgot that the badge is supposed to protect people like me instead of taking things away from us," Henry said simply. "You forgot that being sheriff means you're supposed to be the one person everyone can trust, to do the right thing, even when it's hard." Marcus watched the exchange with professional interest, recognizing that the boy's approach might accomplish more than threats or superior firepower could achieve in changing Morrison's mind about his course of action. "You can still choose to do the right thing," Henry continued, his young voice filled with the kind of hope that adults often lost but children somehow maintained even in the darkest circumstances. You can give up your badge and help Mr. Kane. Fix all the things that went wrong. You can stop being someone people are afraid of and start being someone they can trust again. The simple offer of redemption from a child who had every reason to hate the man who had tried to steal his inheritance seemed to penetrate Morrison's defenses in ways that legal threats had not, and his gun hand began to tremble as he struggled with emotions he had suppressed for years. "Kid," Morrison said, his voice breaking slightly, "you don't understand how far I've fallen. There ain't no coming back from the things I've done, the families I've hurt, the trust I've betrayed." "There's always a way back if you're brave enough to take it," Henry replied, with the kind of absolute certainty that characterized childhood faith in the possibility of redemption. "My pa always said that a man's worst mistake doesn't have to be his last choice if he's willing to do better." Morrison looked around at the crowd of people he had spent years terrorizing and exploiting, seeing in their faces not just anger and fear, but also the possibility of forgiveness if he could find the courage to earn it through genuine remorse and changed behavior. Slowly, carefully, Morrison removed his hand from his gun and began to unbuckle his gun belt, his movements showing the kind of deliberate control that suggested he was making a conscious choice rather than simply surrendering to superior force. "You're right, kid," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying across the square as he placed his badge on the courthouse steps and stepped back with his hands visible and empty. "I forgot what this badge was supposed to mean, and I let fear and greed turn me into the kind of man I used to arrest." Marcus kept his gun drawn but lowered it slightly, recognizing that Morrison's surrender was genuine and that the immediate threat of violence had passed. "Sheriff Morrison," Marcus said formally, "by the authority vested in me as a federal marshal, you are under arrest for official corruption, theft of private property, and conspiracy to defraud territorial citizens of their legal rights." But even as he spoke the words of legal arrest, Marcus's voice carried a tone of respect for Morrison's choice to surrender peacefully rather than forcing a violent resolution that could have resulted in multiple deaths. As Morrison was led away, in chains, and the crowd began to disperse, processing the dramatic reversal they had just witnessed, Marcus knelt beside Henry and placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. "Henry," Marcus said gently, "you showed more courage and wisdom today than most adults manage in a lifetime. Your parents would be proud of the man you're becoming." "Mr. Kane," Henry replied quietly, "what happens to me now? I've got my land back, but I don't know how to work it by myself, and I don't have anywhere else to go." Marcus studied the boy's face, seeing in Henry's eyes the same combination of intelligence, courage, and moral strength that had characterized the best lawman Marcus had known during his years of federal service. "Well, Henry," Marcus said thoughtfully, "it seems to me that Redemption Valley is going to need a new sheriff, and that sheriff is going to need a deputy he can trust completely. Think you might be interested in learning the law enforcement business from someone who believes badges should protect rather than intimidate. The offer of not just protection, but genuine partnership in building a better future for their community filled Henry's eyes with tears of gratitude and hope that had been absent since his parents' death. "Yes, sir," Henry said simply. "I'd be honored to learn from you and help make this town the kind of place where people like my parents can live safely and raise their families without fear." As the sun set over Redemption Valley, painting the courthouse square in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus Kane pinned a deputy's badge on 12-year-old Henry Walsh's chest, beginning a partnership that would transform their community from a place where corruption flourished to a model of frontier justice that would be remembered for generations. Subscribe to our channel now to see how this incredible partnership between a legendary lawman and a brave young deputy transforms an entire community Don't miss the final chapter of this amazing story. 2 years had passed since that fateful sundown when Marcus Kane stripped the badge from corrupt Sheriff Morrison and pinned a deputy star on 12-year-old Henry Walsh's chest, and the transformation in Redemption Valley during that time was remarkable beyond anything the townspeople could have imagined. The community that had once cowered under the rule of a lawman who used his authority to steal from the innocent had become a model of frontier justice where the law truly served and protected all citizens regardless of their wealth or social standing. Henry, now 14, had grown not just in physical stature, but in the kind of moral authority that came from having faced real evil and chosen to respond with courage rather than hatred. Under Marcus's patient guidance, he had learned not just the practical skills of law enforcement, but the deeper principles that separated true peace officers from mere badge-wearing bullies. His youth, which some had initially seen as a liability, had proven to be one of his greatest assets in connecting with people who had learned to distrust anyone wearing a star. Marcus Kane had been elected sheriff by the largest margin in territorial history. His reputation for integrity and his demonstrated commitment to actual justice, making him the unanimous choice of citizens who had spent years longing for law enforcement that protected rather than preyed upon them. But he had insisted from the beginning that his success depended on the partnership he had formed with his young deputy, whose insight into human nature and natural gift for diffusing tense situations had proven invaluable in their work. "Deputy Walsh," Marcus said one morning, as they prepared for their daily patrol through the peaceful streets that had once been terrorized by Morrison's corrupt regime. "I've received a letter from the territorial governor that I think you should hear." Henry looked up from cleaning his sidearm, a responsibility he took seriously despite his youth, because Marcus had taught him that maintaining equipment was as important as knowing how to use it properly. At 14, he was still growing into his frame, but there was something in his bearing that suggested the kind of natural authority that couldn't be taught or faked. "What does the governor want?" Henry asked, though his tone suggested he was prepared for whatever official business might require their attention. "He wants to commend our work in cleaning up corruption throughout this part of the territory," Marcus replied with obvious pride in his young partner's achievements. "Apparently, word of what we've accomplished here has reached all the way to the territorial capital, and other communities are asking for our help in dealing with similar problems." The recognition from territorial authorities was gratifying, but Henry had learned from Marcus's example that true satisfaction came from the daily work of protecting people who needed help, rather than from official accolades or political recognition. "More importantly," Marcus continued, "the governor has authorized the establishment of a new territorial law enforcement training program, and he's asked us to help design the curriculum based on our experiences here. The opportunity to influence how future lawmen would be trained represented a chance to prevent the kind of corruption that had once plagued Redemption Valley from taking root in other communities throughout the territory." "What kind of training are they planning?" Henry asked, his natural curiosity about justice and law enforcement making him eager to understand how their methods might be adapted for use elsewhere. "Training that emphasizes service over authority," Marcus replied. "Programs that teach young men that wearing a badge is about protecting the weak rather than intimidating them, about understanding the law rather than just enforcing rules through violence." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders coming into town at high speed in the way that typically indicated either urgent news or serious trouble. Through the sheriff's office window, they could see a group of men from the neighboring community of Cedar Falls, their faces showing the kind of desperate determination that suggested they were seeking help with problems beyond their local capability to handle. "Sheriff Kane, Deputy Walsh," called out Tom Bradley, a rancher from Cedar Falls, whose reputation for honesty had made him one of the leaders in his community's struggle against corruption. "We need your help with a situation that's gotten beyond what our local authorities can handle." Marcus and Henry stepped outside to meet the delegation, both of them immediately shifting into the professional mode that had made them so effective at dealing with complex problems that required both legal knowledge and practical wisdom. "What's the situation, Tom?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that helped anxious people organize their thoughts and explain their problems clearly. "It's our sheriff, Jake Morrison," Bradley replied, his face showing embarrassment at having to admit his community's problems to outsiders. "Buck Morrison's younger brother, and he's following the same path of corruption and intimidation that his brother used here before you stopped him." The news that corruption had spread to neighboring communities through family connections was disturbing, but not entirely surprising, given the networks of criminal activity that often developed in frontier regions where official oversight was minimal. "What specific crimes are we talking about?" Henry asked, his young voice carrying the authority that came from 2 years of experience in dealing with official corruption and its effects on innocent people. "Property seizures, protection rackets, intimidation of witnesses," Bradley replied grimly. "The same pattern you dealt with here, but Jake Morrison learned from his brother's mistakes, and he's been more careful about covering his tracks." Marcus exchanged a meaningful look with Henry, both of them understanding that they were being asked to take on a challenge that would require all their skills and experience to handle successfully. "Tom," Marcus said carefully, "we're willing to help. But you need to understand that cleaning up official corruption isn't just about arresting the guilty parties. It requires the entire community to be committed to supporting legitimate law enforcement, even when it's inconvenient or difficult." "We understand," Bradley replied firmly. "The people of Cedar Falls are ready to do whatever it takes to have law enforcement that actually serves and protects instead of stealing and intimidating." Henry stepped forward with the kind of quiet confidence that had become his trademark during their partnership. "Mr. Bradley," he said respectfully, "before we can help your community, we need to gather evidence that will stand up in territorial court. That means we'll need people who are willing to testify about what they've witnessed, even though doing so might put them at risk." The mature approach to legal procedure impressed Bradley and the other men from Cedar Falls, confirming what they had heard about the remarkable partnership between the legendary former federal marshal and his teenage deputy. "We've got people ready to testify," Bradley assured them, "and we've got documentary evidence that Jake Morrison has been altering property records just like his brother did here." "Then we'll come," Marcus said simply. "But we do this according to law and proper procedure. No vigilante justice, no shortcuts that might let guilty parties escape on technicalities." The mission to Cedar Falls that followed was indeed challenging, requiring Marcus and Henry to navigate not just the legal complexities of proving official corruption, but also the political pressures that came from challenging powerful interests that had profited from the existing system. But their careful adherence to proper procedure and their demonstrated commitment to justice over expedience eventually resulted in Jake Morrison's arrest and the restoration of legitimate law enforcement to another suffering community. 3 years later, as Henry celebrated his 17th birthday and his promotion to full Sheriff of Redemption Valley, following Marcus's appointment as Territorial Law Enforcement Supervisor, their partnership had become legendary throughout the Western Territories. As an example of what could be accomplished when integrity was paired with competence and youthful idealism was guided by experienced wisdom. "Henry," Marcus said during the ceremony that marked Henry's installation as the youngest sheriff in territorial history, "when I first met you on those courthouse steps, I saw a boy who had lost everything, but refused to lose his faith in justice. Today, I'm watching a man whose commitment to protecting the innocent has inspired an entire generation of lawmen to remember why they pinned on their badges in the first place. You taught me that wearing a badge isn't about power over other people, Henry replied, his voice carrying across the courthouse square where he had once begged for justice as a desperate orphan. It's about using whatever authority we have to make sure that other children never have to face what I faced, that other families never have to fear the very people who are supposed to protect them. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with citizens from throughout the territory gathering to honor the partnership that had transformed their understanding of what law enforcement could accomplish when conducted according to principles of service rather than self-interest. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Buck Morrison, the former corrupt sheriff who had served his prison sentence and was now working as a ranch hand trying to rebuild his life, approached Henry with obvious difficulty and genuine remorse. "Sheriff Walsh," Morrison said quietly, "I know I don't have any right to ask for your forgiveness, but I want you to know that watching what you and Marcus accomplished here helped me understand what I should have been doing with my badge all along." Henry studied the man who had once tried to steal his inheritance and destroy his future, seeing not the threatening figure from his childhood, but a human being who had made terrible mistakes and was genuinely trying to atone for them. "Mr. Morrison," Henry said gently, "the measure of a man isn't the worst thing he's ever done. It's whether he has the courage to do better when given the chance." The forgiveness offered by a young sheriff to the man who had once been his tormentor demonstrated the kind of moral growth that had made Henry Walsh's story an inspiration throughout the territories. Proof that justice was best served not through revenge, but through the patient work of building better communities where such corruption could never again take root. The orphan boy who had once begged for justice on courthouse steps had indeed grown into a man whose badge represented everything that law enforcement should be: protection for the weak, service to the community, and the unwavering principle that justice belonged to everyone regardless of their age, wealth, or social standing. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more incredible stories of justice, redemption, and the power of courage to transform entire communities. Hit that subscribe button now and join our community of believers in the triumph of good over corruption.